So I have a few questions which I'll talk to you about in this next segment, and in the end I will be taking questions from the audience. Okay, Pronab, so as you said, various people are making forecasts, and none of them are give us a lot of hope. We are going to go through a long, tough grind, but it's probably fair to say that your prospects that you see in the absence of a huge stimulus is a little more negative than others. Let me begin by sort of probing you a little bit about some of the underlying assumptions. A couple of things which came to my mind as I was reading your 5-part series in Ideas for India. One is the factor of inventories. Now, I don't have hard data on this, but my suspicion is that there has been a lot of inventory depletion over the last 2-3 months as we went into the lockdown. You can think of sort of grocery store items, for example, which were outside essential commodities, but they were nevertheless in supply. So they were coming out of inventories, I would guess. It is plausible to think that, firms will try to rebuild their inventories, and that could be an endogenous sort of fiscal stimulus, as it were. So that's one thing. The second thing which crossed my mind as I was reading your pieces, that, we talk about fundamentals versus expectations. We talk about business cycle upswings and downswings. Part of it is fundamentals. There's an oil price shock. We cannot wish it away. It's there. So that may trigger off a recession. But, if investor confidence falls, then that is itself a trigger. So to what extent do you see in this landscape that you painted for us, right, for the next couple of months and even years, how much do you see is the role of consumer confidence, investor confidence, psychological factors driving the negative growth, as opposed to fundamentals like, for example, falling exports? We can't wish it away. It's there. So could you give us a sense of how you see the division between psychology versus fundamentals?
Okay. Parikshit, so far in what I have talked about only fundamentals. So lockdown is a fundamental. You couldn't open your factory even if you wanted to. And there is no expectation of role in that. Exports are fundamental. Those are the two. The role of expectations is over and above that. Now, which way they will play out is really the question. Now, again, one has to be a little careful because when you're talking about, let's say, the inventory rebuilding effect, the reason I haven't taken it into account is that the inventory rebuilding process is really driven by your expectations. Do you expect consumption demand to do going forward? That will determine your pace of inventory rebuilding. So it is extremely expectation dependent. The point is that one of the reasons I didn't bring expectations in, if I did, the story would sound even worse. And the reason for it is that the Indian economy was on a downhill slope for the last year, nearly 2 years. And my fear is that expectations were weak to begin with. And there is nothing in the shock or the response of the government which would reverse that expectation, the trend in the expectation. If anything, it would tend to reinforce it. Now, if it does, then the story looks even grimmer. But unorganized sector, which does tend to have a higher resilience, not because they have great expectations, but because they're driven by essentially survival instincts. For them, it is not a matter of a few more rupees here or there. For them, it's a matter of life or death. So the resilience of the Indian informal sector is essentially a supporting structure to the Indian economy. But it comes from a source which is not commonly taken into account in economics.
there's good news. People were surprised about the US unemployment reports, right? It's 13%, which is lower than. So that kind of news is not very indicative about the long-term prospects of a V-shaped recovery, you think?
Yeah, and it's also not necessarily indicative of what's going to happen to the US in the future.
Okay.
We need to be very clear about that. That's number one. Number two, you have to also understand, Parikshit, in the US, the lockdown was of far lesser severity than what happened in India. And despite that, their unemployment went up by 31 million people. Now it's starting to improve a little bit, but so has ours. So if you look at the CMI data, we started off with unemployment of 122 million, and now we've come down to about 90 million. So that part of it is there. But if you think about my 12.5% story, what you're looking at, if I leave the labor output relationship roughly unchanged, you're talking about unemployment of somewhere around the 50 to 60 million range.
Okay. So, Pranab, this economic package has been criticized on the grounds that it's high on sort of liquidity infusion and low on actual fiscal spending and commitments and stimulus. So the rough division is it's 10% of GDP, 9% is liquidity, 1% is fiscal. Now, I'm thinking of the liquidity part, and that's a part where people have, the government has done a lot. Now, these credit lines which have been created, like 3 lakh crores for the MSMEs plus some extra top of. Now, I was wondering whether we can take it for granted that all of it will be used or even a big chunk of it will be used. I mean, some of it you touched upon in your talk, right? But the fundamental problem is that the government can underwrite the loans, right? Even without that, it's implicitly underwritten, right? If the PSU...
No, it's explicitly underwritten.
No,
in the package, it is 100% guaranteed.
That's right. But I'm saying in ordinary times, eventually the government has to recapitalize the bank, pick up the tab. So in that sense, it's implicitly underwritten for PSU banks. Right? So that has been made explicit. But what the officials often face, right, especially top management, is that if a lot of these loans go bad, they will face flack, right? Various health secretaries in various state governments have been fired. That has been a report which has been doing the rounds. Politically, their feet being held is something which is very difficult for the government to commit not to do. So how do you see that played out? Do you think, and already there are reports that, a lot of this liquidity is lying around, either banks are not, cautious about lending or there are no takers. So do you think this massive amount of liquidity will end up being utilized and go into saving, let's say, the MSMEs and so on and so forth? And also, if we could also comment about possible complementarity between the fiscal part and the liquidity part. Okay. In the absence of fiscal stimulus, if a lot of firms go bankrupt, then a lot of these loans will turn bad, and that'll start eating into the liquidity part of it too.
Sort of begin with the easy part of your question, which is about the liquidity. You're absolutely right. It's actually more than that. The fact that the financial sector, the banks, are not lending is already clear. So look at what has happened to the bank deposits in the reverse repo account of the RBI. It shot up by 8.5 trillion rupees. That's about half the package. Okay? Now, clearly, if it's sitting in reverse repo, it's not being lent. So one has to keep a weather eye on that. But let's take the worst case scenario that it stays within the reverse repo window. Then two things happen. First is, of course, the borrowers are going to go down the tube. They're going to go broke. The second is the banks will go broke because they've got all this liquidity which is not earning them very much. It's earning them 3.35%, and they're going to have a hard time servicing their liabilities. Now, given a situation like that, the first best alternative would be for the banks to pump that money into the companies, which is what it is intended for. But if that doesn't happen, and again, one is hearing a lot of feedback that banks are scared. They are scared, even though these loans are 100% government guaranteed. The banks are scared that if they actually call in the guarantee, loan goes bad and they invoke that guarantee, that's going to open the door for government auditors to step in, which no banker wants. So what one is hearing in the market is that the banks are saying, yes, we'll give you the money, but I want a collateral. Now, most companies are already collateralized to the hilt. So what they would be doing in probability is to extend the amount they borrow against that collateral, which makes the insecurity of banks even higher. Now, the second part of it was, do they go together? And the answer is yes. You see, if the banks are either unable or unwilling to lend, then this overhang of liquidity is actually pretty dangerous. This is where, if the government actually steps in with a larger package, they can actually borrow this money from the banks at fairly low interest rates. Okay. Now, my sense is that the funds that we have at the moment, which is, as I said, 8.5 lakh crores, will barely suffice to cover the tax losses of the government. My estimate of the tax losses is about 4.5 lakh crores for states and about 3.1 lakh crores for the center. So it's about 7.6 lakh crores as against 8.5 lakh crores that you have in the reverse repo. So it's barely going to cover that, but that's fine. Then it, of course, leaves the open question is, how do you give the additional stimulus that I've been talking about, adding up to another 5 lakh crores?
Okay. Fiscal measures that you're advocating also has this additional benefit that you can boost the confidence of the banking sector. Let's talk about the fiscal space, because this has been one strain of opinion that we have a limited fiscal space, that the government will be reckless, spend willy-nilly like this. Could you give us an indication? I mean, you mentioned 5 lakh crores as the most that they can go in a year, but if I understood you correctly, that is like the capacity, how much they can ramp up.
Yeah.
But could you give us a sense of, fiscal prudence-wise? I mean, what percentage of GDP, let's say last year's GDP, can the government spend extra before it starts looking unsustainable from a long-term viewpoint, or before the benefits of that spending outweighs, the long-term cost in terms of fiscal sustainability? But there's also this issue of immediate source of funding. Been a lot of talk about that. There's been talk of monetizing the debt, right? Require changing some laws that the government cannot directly borrow from the central bank, and people have been urging about that. But on that front, as far as getting the immediate source of funding, this is something we just talked about, but let me just sort of amplify that. It seems to me that an elephant in the room is the money which is piling up in the banks, because fixed capital investment is practically collapsed and will remain very low for the foreseeable future. That part of bank deposits is piling up, and it's being ferried into the RBI, and government is implicitly paying interest on that at the repo rate anyway without using it. So when it comes to questions of funding, isn't there a strong point to be made that there is this money sitting there, which if the government allows it to be ported into the RBI, and then that creates a reduction in money supply, deflation, other macroeconomic problems, so that public borrowing using that money, either from banks or for individuals, is the way to go, or the major source of funding for the fiscal stimulus that you're advocating. And also on top of that, what is a prudent limit to which the government can go?
As far as prudent limits are concerned, one can define prudence in many, many ways. But so far, the only compelling argument that is about the total size of public debt. Our public debt had come down to about 66% and then has been crawling up and is now at about 71 odd percent. Question is, how far can we let it go? Because in a sense that directly answers your question. It determines how much you can allow the fiscal deficit to go up. Now, there is no hard and fast rule on this. Okay, and this is where expectations and perhaps hope comes in, because the serviceability of the public debt really depends upon what is the rate of growth of nominal GDP in the country. And we're not talking about the nominal GDP growth rate in the current year. We are talking about it in a longer term sense, because if you look at the average tenure of government debt, that's about 16 years. So we're really talking about what do we expect the nominal rate of growth of Indian GDP to be over the next 16 years. And if you take the kind of numbers that we're used to working with, is somewhere around 11% nominal GDP growth rate over an extended period, then you can easily allow the debt stock to go up to roughly about 84% of GDP.
But part of that will be revenue losses.
A part of that would be revenue losses, and a part of that would be actual investment.
Eventually, taxes have to be raised, right? I mean, with this extra debt, the government may not do it immediately, but somewhere down the line, taxes have to be raised. That has been a controversial topic. As you know, there was the case of Indian Revenue Service officers who were accused of jumping the gun, but there's been talk of wealth taxes. In some Latin American countries, they're calling it a solidarity tax, an immediate extra tax on high-income individuals and corporations. We have just come out of a much trumpeted reduction in corporate tax rates to attract investment, right, which was in the last budget. Right now, should the government look for extra tax revenue, new taxes, or should it be?
Well, this is a singularly bad time to look for additional taxes, because what we are looking at is a situation where both incomes and asset values are impaired. And any attempt at raising tax revenues at this stage will just make matters much worse, much worse. And even a fiscal expansion is not going to help, because there we will get into your expectational problems, right, and we may get into very, very deep trouble. It really should happen once we reach a stage where we think we are back on our normal, stable, sustainable growth path.
So on the same grounds, I think you've written in your article that the planned disinvestment for this year, 2001, that should also be pushed back, because
sure,
they won't get more value for money at this point.
Yeah, disinvestment is a bad idea in the current situation.
In terms of timing.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, let me come to the issue of cash transfers, and that has also generated a lot of talk. There's, of course, the task, the sort of macroeconomic task of reviving the economy, taking out of Asian recession and so on. So that's the fiscal stimulus part. But the income distribution has dramatically shifted, and it's especially the people at lower economic earning levels have taken a hit. So people are complaining about the lack of too much, cash transfers and income support. So the finance minister, in I think a couple of interviews, has said in response that she doesn't have a clean mechanism through which to put money in people's pockets. It's all messy. Unlike Western economies, we don't have most people are not in the tax net, so the government doesn't have any idea of how to identify who are the poor, whom to give cash transfers to. Now, what they have, the little amount, the 500 rupees that has been put down on the table, that is in the Jan Dhan Yojana account. So the principal sort of components for the small amounts of cash transfer seems to be the Jan Dhan Yojana accounts and NREGA, along with a few other things. Now, I want to sort of sound you out on whether we are making the best of a bad situation. There's no doubt that we don't have a clean mechanism to make cash transfers. But wouldn't it have been better to go by the PDS list, right? Because PDS uniquely identifies households and household members, and it is supposed to cover 2/3 of the population. So you have one big part of the problem solved, right? You have no idea whether a Jan Dhan Yojana account, whether a family has 5 of these accounts or 1 or none. Whereas identification of beneficiaries is done in the PDS. So have we missed an opportunity there by not trying to use the PDS list to put money in people's pockets, either using DBT where it has been set up, or through, let's say, Odisha style, direct cash transfers or post offices or what have you? So what do you think about the delivery mechanisms that we have chosen?
Well, no, I agree. The list is more complete and more comprehensive than the Jan Dhan account. There's no question about that. However, this is where the nature of federalism and the politics of federalism kick in. The problem is that as far as Jan Dhan accounts are concerned, the central government can transfer money directly into Jan Dhan accounts. It is within its competence. For PDS, it has to perforce go through the states. And then you get into the whole problem, who gets credit. Because remember, at the end of this, all of it is about who gets the political kudos for it.
So you think that political factor has played a big role in terms of...
I suspect it has. Because, so far, the states have not been getting the kind of support they need. What you're talking about is going beyond need. So you're making them an active partner.
Right. Let me come to the fiscal federalism, since you touched upon it. We are obviously in this situation where the division of resources and responsibility is very lopsided. Health is a state subject, but obviously the center has much more fiscal room than states. So given the experience that we are going through right now, do you think that we have to really seriously rethink the structure of our fiscal federalism? That a lot of restructuring has to be done? Or is it the case that it's largely a matter of trust? So for example, the center will always be able to borrow at lower rates than states. So you cannot legislate that, right? If you want the center to borrow at lower rates and transfer that money to states, it has to come through political trust. So given the mismatches that we see between responsibility and resources, do you see it should be solved through formal restructuring of the nature of a fiscal federalism, or some sort of improvement in
Parikshit, we again forget our own history. This belief that the center cannot borrow and on-lend to the states is again of relatively recent origin. It used to be a standard procedure in Government of India when I joined it in 1990, where the center was doing exactly that. So what the center would do is it would borrow from the market, would on-lend to the states at a 0.5% interest margin. And that still made it a full 1% margin below what the states would have been able to raise. So history is there. Now, why that was given up is a story for another day, and you would need a different speaker to go into.